I looked at my father's bank account and saw almost $600 million in it. His heart seemed to stop beating, and then it began to pound as if it was trying to break out. Money. Money I couldn't even dream of. They seemed to hypnotize me with their silent radiance, promising freedom and security. But this moment of triumph was overshadowed by the weight of loss. My father, the only one who was always there for me, who supported me and never turned away, left this world, leaving me alone with this wealth, as if with an unsolved puzzle. As I stood over the silent numbers on the screen, another truth weighed down on me, heavier than any sum. As soon as I realized that this capital could allow me to start over, break away from my past, my husband came home. There was a strange, cold expression on his face, and I felt uneasy when he casually said that he wanted a divorce. He said it so easily, so dispassionately, as if he was demanding an account for a failed business project. I felt a cold wave spreading in my chest. The one who swore to be with me in joy and in trouble was ready to throw me out of his life as quickly as an old, unnecessary fabric is torn. It turned out that he had been waiting for this moment for a long time to get rid of me, the moment when he could touch the money, the inheritance that so conveniently passed to me after the death of my kind father-in-law. He looked at me not as a wife, partner, or loved one, but as a guiding sign to the coveted amount. I remembered how my husband's father, the man from whom he inherited this passion for money, often talked about honesty and mutual understanding. But now those words seemed mocking. My husband saw nothing in me except the opportunity to live a luxurious life without the slightest effort. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I always guessed that he was not who he claims to be. There were sometimes cold, appraising notes in his gaze, as if he was weighing my every word and deed. But it was only now that I fully realized his true nature. I clenched my fists, trying my best to hold back the rising rage, but the anger at myself was stronger. How could I not see the obvious? How could I allow myself to be deceived? He was grinning impudently when he handed me the divorce papers, as if he was enjoying what was happening. Triumph flashed in his eyes as I grabbed the papers without hesitation and signed them. A heavy stroke of the pen on each point, like parting with dreams of love and fidelity. I tossed the signed papers back to him, saying coldly, "The rest depends on you." His eyes narrowed, a slight confusion flashed in them, and he replied smugly that, of course, he would send my things. I was sure Kevin was relieved to accept my consent to the marriage, but it was in his lightness that I saw what many might consider a disadvantage, his unpredictability. He talked about himself honestly, almost with a good-natured grin, acknowledging his weaknesses. "When it comes to relationships, I'm terrible," he once said with a chuckle. "I get dumped quickly. It's probably because of my careless nature, but what can you do? It's hard to change who you are." At that moment, I noticed how, despite all his weaknesses, he never avoided my company. On the contrary, he listened attentively to even the most difficult stories without interrupting. Being business acquaintances, we were not close, but from the first day of our communication, I realized that his lightness and simplicity attract. When I visited his office with the documents, he cheered me up with jokes, so that even my darkest thoughts receded under his warm smile. It was a rare moment when someone besides me looked into my heart, filled with silence, and tried to drown out this emptiness. One day, when we were walking in the park, I accidentally dropped the check, and Kevin, laughing, said, "Wow, my wallet is twice as thick with change." "You dropped the check." His childlike simplicity was surprising. We both laughed, and I saw in him something more than just an acquaintance. Even his habit of losing receipts and counting change didn't seem annoying to me, rather, it became his calling card, something naive and sincere that reminded me again what it feels like to laugh sincerely. "You're like a child, Kevin," I teased him. He just chuckled, replying that, "Still, I'm 45, you know." And somehow his words caused me to feel strangely calm. Every day my longing gradually subsided. A year later, when he confessed his feelings, I felt something change in me. My heart, which had recently been filled with grief, began to heal. Leaving the pain of loss in the past, I dared to give us a chance. People around us were whispering, discussing, but it didn't seem important to me anymore. A month later, Kevin, who had become my mainstay, suddenly suggested, maybe we should think about marriage. His words took me by surprise. For all the ease with which he usually spoke, this sentence sounded serious, almost uncharacteristic of him. He noticed my silence and hurried to explain, I know that our circumstances are not the simplest, and age also makes itself felt. It seems to me that important decisions should not be postponed. At that moment, I knew what to say. The voices from the past have fallen silent, only my intuition remains. Okay, let's get married, I said, surprised at how confident my voice sounded. Kevin's lightness rubbed off on me, as if his childish carelessness had made me more open. But I also knew that his character was a complex mixture of carelessness and caring, which made him reliable and honest. Soon, talking about everyday worries, he mentioned his father, who was already aged and needed care. He still thinks he's young and can work, even after he's 70, Kevin smiled. But my health is failing, and I help him as much as I can. I couldn't help but ask about his mother, and Kevin's answer made me think. He was talking about his parents' divorce, about how long it had been since he had seen her, and suddenly he fell silent. It was a difficult topic, and I understood why he was in no hurry to share it earlier. We continued to discuss our future, and Kevin offered to introduce me to his father before we finally decided how we would live our lives. Kevin walked me to the car, and on the way back we talked about his father, and there was something warm in his words, but with a hint of hidden bitterness. You know, Dad was always like that, careful, a little stingy, like I said. But when it came to business, he turned into a completely different person. A serial entrepreneur, as he likes to call himself. He opens companies, develops them to success, and then sells them and takes on something new, Kevin said with a note of admiration in his voice, as if talking about some childhood hero. I tried to imagine such a person, restrained, economical, but at the same time willing to take risks and decisive in business. Kevin's father was clearly used to following a certain lifestyle, where every expense was under strict control. I realized that Kevin inherited from him this ability to combine ease with efficiency, to be the center of attention, but at the same time to stay a little apart, not always sharing his thoughts and desires. He could afford anything. To build a mansion in which you could easily get lost. But instead, he lives in this house, which seems luxurious only from the outside. Kevin smiled, adding, you would like to see him enter his small workshop on the ground floor. He has always worked with documents, drawings, not trusting electronic files, and it seems that only there he feels really comfortable. And you've never been involved in his companies? I asked in surprise, realizing that Kevin's father seemed to be deliberately distancing his son from his business. Kevin sighed with a barely perceptible shrug. No, Dad has never involved me in his business. He always thought that I should start from scratch, just like he once did. He says I need to earn my place in the world, just like him. The only thing he spoils me with is permission to live in his house, Kevin chuckled, but there was something in his eyes that I couldn't immediately identify. Perhaps it was resentment, perhaps an admission that, oddly enough, there was a lesson in this. I listened to him, trying to imagine myself in his place, and it became clear to me that Kevin was burdened by the lack of intimacy with his father. An adult man who had passed through many trials, he still somehow aspired to the recognition of his father, like a child waiting for approval for every, even the smallest success. Do you think that made it harder for you to achieve your goals? I asked cautiously, feeling that this question might hurt him. Kevin thought for a moment before replying, I guess so. When you know that you have support, you move forward more confidently. But I've learned to be careful and independent. And, it's not that bad. Although sometimes I think that everything could have been different. We continued on our way in silence, and I felt a new depth gradually opening up between us, not yet familiar to me. I sighed with restraint, realizing that the upcoming conversation was inevitable. Kevin was lying on the couch, comfortably ensconced among the pillows, and lazily watching TV. His gaze was focused on the screen, as if he hadn't noticed my concern. I stood in the doorway for a while, looking around the room, which looked more and more like a bachelor pad than the cozy family home I had imagined. Kevin, I began, not trying to hide the slight irritation in my voice. We agreed that you would do household chores if I worked. After all, it was your decision. He looked away from the screen and looked at me with a tired expression on his face, as if everything I said was just another tirade not worth paying attention to. I know, I'm just a little tired today. Dad asked me to help him in the morning, and then I lost track of time. I looked at him intently. His words seemed light, and I couldn't help but notice that he didn't look tired, rather relaxed. But it wasn't hard to at least cook dinner or clean up the kitchen, Kevin, I said quietly, trying not to get annoyed. You said you wanted to take care of your father, devote your time and attention to him. But that also includes taking care of the house. He smiled faintly, as if my words hadn't awakened any shame in him. Don't worry, I'll do it. I just didn't have time today. We've only been living together for a month. I'll get used to it. You know I'm not such a bad husband, he added with a wink, as if hinting that this whole situation is not as serious as I perceive it to be. I didn't say anything, deciding that maybe it really wasn't worth making a big deal out of a molehill. But at the same time, I was uneasy. I remembered his words about wanting to devote himself to caring for my father and felt disappointed, as if there was something unsaid in his promises. The following days passed the same way. Kevin sometimes tried to do something around the house, then just shirked under the pretext that he cares about his father. When I came home, I increasingly found him on the couch, with a book or watching TV, and household chores remained untouched. The situation escalated when his father, who was increasingly frowning at the sight of his son in activity, once called me over and quietly, with thoughtful bitterness in his eyes, said, "Mary, be strict with him." He was always a little frivolous when it came to commitment. I thought that after leaving his job, he would find meaning in taking care of me and the house, but I'm afraid it turned out to be a burden to him. These words hurt me a lot. I wanted to protect Kevin, because he was my husband and had made a difficult commitment. But at the same time, I saw the truth in them that I couldn't ignore anymore. His father-in-law nodded proudly, his eyes twinkling at the memory. Oh, yes, it was a great project. The company was really thriving, we had the best suppliers, and we became one of the leaders in the seafood market in Europe. I knew that this venture would require huge investments, but I did not regret it. Germany is a difficult market, and the competition there is fierce, but I wanted to test myself, to show that I can cope with any challenge. I listened with genuine admiration. To imagine that my humble father-in-law, who at first glance avoided ostentatious luxury and noisy spending, was once the driving force behind such a large enterprise, was unexpected and a little exciting. But it's not just a business, it's a real success story, I remarked, peering into his face, which showed that hidden pride that was usually so rarely manifested. He smiled slightly, as if my words had shamed him a little. Well, Mary, that was probably my luxury. I'm not one of those people who builds palaces for themselves or sets off fireworks for their own pleasure. But when it comes to business, when you see that you can build something significant, something that will change other people's lives, that's what I really enjoy. His words did not just sound sincere, there was a deep experience in them, the one that makes you choose your judgments with caution and deliberation. This man, whom Kevin called stingy, had an unusual sense of purpose and responsibility that seemed alien to my husband. And this comparison flashed into my mind suddenly, like a lamp in a dark room, leaving behind a shadow of doubt. Was Kevin really not ready for such a responsibility, despite his words? He often said that taking care of the house and family was the main thing, but every week it became more and more obvious to me that such things tired him, seemed uninteresting to him. I remembered his confidence when he first left work, his promises to take over all the household chores. There was sincerity in his eyes, but did he have the patience and willpower to fulfill his promises? My thoughts were interrupted by my father-in-law's voice. He sighed and, with a slight grin, added, "You see, Mary, no matter how much money you have, it doesn't mean anything if you don't use it wisely and with purpose. My path has always been humble. All I have spent is investments, which I hope will benefit further. I know Kevin thinks I'm stingy, but he hasn't quite figured out yet that money alone isn't happiness. They are only a means, and the real pleasure is to see how, thanks to your efforts, something develops, grows, and bears fruit." His words sounded like a lesson, and I felt a sense of clarity and inspiration awaken somewhere deep inside me. My feelings towards Kevin began to change, like waves that rise and fall depending on his next act. At the beginning of our marriage, I felt affection for him, even saw in him, perhaps, something more than what seemed on the surface. But now, when I found him lying on the couch every night, when requests for help were perceived as a burden, and spending reached frightening proportions, I couldn't help but think how this illusion had changed so quickly. He didn't even notice that, flirting with luxury, he was losing respect for the very idea of our life together, considering it only a chance to take advantage of other people's efforts. Soon I began to return home later, reluctantly stepping on the threshold, not wanting to see his displeased face, even before my arrival, waiting for dinner and, what seemed to me to be devoid of any reasonableness, reprimanding me for delays. One evening, when I heard his reproaches again, I couldn't resist saying, "You can't see only service and comfort in our house, Kevin. If you have chosen to become a householder, you need first of all to be a part of the house, and not just its temporary king, who lies on the couch and requires service." At first he was silent, his eyes narrowed, as if I had violated some unspoken contract that he probably made with himself, considering him mine too. Then he laughed, abruptly and sharply, as if I had said something funny, but more bitter than funny. "Do you think I should have been cooking dinner and vacuuming for you all my life? My mom always said that someone else would take care of me, that with money I would have everything I wanted. And I found what I was looking for," he added, nodding towards my bank statements that were on my desk after the last checks. Those words shot through me like a sharp prick. It became clear to me that our marriage was probably just another opportunity for him not to work, to look for easy ways, and I was part of this delusion, which he was not shy about. He had no inner respect for what I had put into our lives, for the independence that I was moving towards after going through a lot of difficulties. Disgust welled up in me, but the thought of my test stopped me, kept me within the limits of patience. I understood that if I had left, David would have been left with a son who cared more about his fleeting whims than about his aging father. That night, I stayed in the living room longer than usual, dealing with financial matters that Kevin found unimportant. I evaluated every expense and every check, noting in my mind how I would pay off debt obligations and restore the account. Meanwhile, Kevin was snoring freely on the couch, as if our whole life was just one long day off for him. When I heard his desperate voice screaming on the other end of the line, I remained calm, almost indifferent, but a whirlwind of conflicting emotions was bubbling inside me. For so long I was silent. I tolerated his indifference, his assumed importance, his feigned superiority. Now, hearing his hysterical tone, I felt a strange satisfaction, an almost childish sense of justice. "You set this up on purpose, didn't you?" he shouted, as if trying to accuse me of deliberate deception. "What did you do with the bank account? Where's all that money, huh? You said Dad's bill was huge. There are not 1 million, let alone 600 million. I just smiled a little, imagining him rushing around the room now, stunned and humiliated by his own greed. There was confusion and resentment in his voice on the phone, as if the world he surrounded himself with had suddenly collapsed in 1 second. "Kevin," I said calmly, trying to keep my voice as calm as possible. "Apparently, you were wrong about your father. Apparently, you've never understood him at all." "What are you talking about?" His anger turned to bewilderment, and a painful note appeared in his voice. "My father always said that he was saving up for the future, that it was all for me. Are you saying that he tricked me? That he was lying to me?" Now there was silence in the receiver, only his heavy breathing could be heard, as if he could not come to himself in any way. Involuntarily, a memory came to mind of how my father-in-law, a restrained, reliable man, conscientiously helped around the house and tried to make my life easier. I imagined his calm gaze and proud bearing, the exact opposite of his spoiled son, whom he probably didn't even trust deep down. All this time, he may have seen Kevin as a weak man, used to only taking, but unable to give anything away. "No, Kevin," I replied, trying to speak softly but firmly. "Your father didn't lie to you. He was a wise man and did what he thought was right. Maybe he knew you better than you think." At the other end, I heard some kind of hissing. Kevin, apparently, restrained his emotions, and then whispered with a tear, as if there was a lump in his throat. You don't understand anything. He deceived me. It's impossible for him to leave me like this. We've always been close. He couldn't." At that moment, I felt inner peace, as if the long-awaited justice had finally overtaken Kevin. He, who used to consider himself a kind of prince, heir to wealth and power, saw for the first time how fleeting his illusions were. "You thought that money would always revolve around you, that your father's inheritance would give you the right to continue living in idleness," I continued. "But you know, Kevin, maybe now you'll start seeing things the way they are." Kevin fell silent, and in the silence, I suddenly felt an involuntary laugh begin to rise to my lips. Quiet, but full of relief and celebration. All those humiliations that I went through, all those sleepless nights, all the moments when he treated me like an ATM, turned into this calm, almost meditative feeling. Kevin became silent, depressed, in a way I had never seen him. I felt light. I heard his heavy, ragged breathing, like a man who suddenly realized that the ground beneath his feet had cracked. He, who used to consider himself the sole heir to a multimillion-dollar fortune, suddenly faced a bitter reality. His ambitions and dreams of luxury crashed against the wall of his father's foresight and common sense. It was his first real encounter with the harsh truth of life, and I decided not to make it easier for him by responding with the same calm determination. "Yes, Kevin," I said, keeping my voice even but slightly cold. 600 million is the amount your father left as collateral to pay off his debts. As you can see, he was not a careless rich man, as you may have thought. He was a man who was trying to create something significant, albeit not without risk. This debt is his own legacy, if you want to say so. But those 80,000 are all that's really left to you." 80,000? He said it as if the numbers themselves caused him bewilderment and horror. "But it can't be true. His whole life, his work. How can it only cost 80,000? His voice became quieter, almost losing itself in a tone of helplessness that I had not noticed before. After all, he was used to seeing in his father only a source of funds and the opportunity to live in prosperity without bothering himself. Now, in the face of the whole truth about how carefully his father planned his finances and where he directed his fortune, he seemed to be in a broken trough. I saw that he did not understand at all what responsibility meant, not to mention that his father's duty was not a whim, but the result of his labors and risky decisions, which he considered worth creating something of his own, perhaps valuable to him personally. Kevin, I continued, slowly, holding back every word. Your father knew the value of his money and was not afraid of taking risks. He was not the kind of person who would save millions just to keep them gathering dust in a bank. He wanted to create something of his own, something significant, although not everything turned out as he planned. This money is not just numbers in a bank account. This is his life, his aspirations, his work. But how? Kevin did not find what to answer. The words did not come, and I could almost see how he was getting lost, confused in his ideas about wealth and reality. After a brief but tense pause, I continued, a little more gently, although still holding back the inner sarcasm. And by the way, yes, he left you 80,000. Maybe he was hoping that you could use them, maybe even appreciate them. This is your inheritance. But the 600 million that you tried to take away is not available to you. They will go to pay off his debt that was originally intended. Your father knew what he was doing when he trusted me to manage these things. My ex fell silent, and I felt something like awareness grow in him, albeit belatedly. Immediately after our conversation, full of rude reproaches and disappointments, he did not call again. Apparently, he realized the futility of his attempts and fully felt the consequences of his impulse. This conversation left me with a strange feeling of relief, as if with his voice I finally closed a difficult chapter of my life. And a completely new path opened up ahead, free from unnecessary dramas and burdensome expectations. For the first time in a long time, I could feel that every step I took now belonged to me and no one else. In the evening, returning to my cozy, albeit small apartment, I looked around the space, which, unlike the previous house, was filled with meaning. Here, every subject was chosen by me, and there was no place for old memories, only my own story, which was now being built on a blank sheet. I felt this release almost physically, and recent events filled me with confidence, as if my father-in-law's voice, left in my memory, whispered instructions to me. His image, his desire to work, his willingness to take risks, all this has now become an invisible support for me. The $40,000 that my kind father-in-law had left me was flickering in even numbers in the bank account. This money was more than just a sum for me. I decided not to spend them, partly because they have become for me a symbol of the trust and support left to me by this person. He always talked about money as something temporary that comes and goes, but never replaces true values. When I saw these numbers on the account, it seemed to me that I had a small piece of his wisdom, part of his continuous path that connected us even after he left. These thoughts, imbued with his wisdom and care, gave me strength and confidence in every new endeavor. The work that used to seem sometimes tedious and routine to me was now perceived differently. I drew inspiration from it and the opportunity to move forward. It was as if his love of life and efficiency had been passed on to me along with this modest inheritance. I began to work with double diligence, realizing that now my efforts would lead me to success, and no one would take away from me what I would achieve on my own.